December 2024. A 50-ton excavator sinks its hydraulic arm into a reinforced concrete wall that's been waiting for this moment for almost 70 years. The crash echoes down East Grand Boulevard as debris falls where 40,000 workers once built the most luxurious cars in America. 3.5 million square feet designed to last centuries turn to dust in front of news cameras and the eyes of neighbors who've spent their entire lives staring at these ruins. $26 million from the American Rescue Plan, money meant to ease the effects of a pandemic spent burying the bones of a factory that died in 1956. But before the excavators arrived, before the 68 years of abandonment, before the unsolved murders and the rave parties where Detroit techno was born, before a Bengal tiger escaped during a photo shoot and a Nazi sign appeared in the windows, there was a moment that defined everything this factory ever stood for. A moment nobody wants to remember, but that explains why America builds industrial cathedrals and then leaves them to die. June 3, 1943. It's Thursday. The air inside the Packard plant smells like motor oil, sweat, and tension. 40,000 workers fill the hallways of Detroit's largest factory, building airplane engines to win the war against Hitler. Then someone switches on the PA system, and a voice with a southern drawl barks a phrase nobody will ever forget. I'd rather see Hitler and Hirohito win than work next to a N times GER. 25,000 white workers walk off the job. War production grinds to a halt. All because the company just promoted 3 black men to the assembly line. Think about that for a second. In the middle of World War II, with American soldiers dying in the Pacific and gearing up to invade Europe, 25,000 workers decided their racial hatred mattered more than defeating the Nazis. They chose Hitler over their black countrymen. And this didn't happen at some forgotten factory in the Deep South. This happened in Detroit, in the Cathedral of American Industry. In the same building that was manufacturing the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that would power the P-51 Mustang fighters, the planes that would change the course of the war. But this isn't just the story of a hate strike. This is something much bigger. This is the ultimate parable of American industrial capitalism compressed into concrete and steel. The birth sparked by an insult, the rise to building cars for Stalin and Roosevelt and the Japanese imperial family, the glory of manufacturing the engines that won the war, and the devastating collapse that left 11,000 workers on the street, while the most innovative factory in the world became the global symbol of urban decay. How did America's most prestigious automobile factory become the most photographed ruin porn on the planet? How does a building go from producing over 1,600,000 luxury cars for kings and dictators to housing corpses and graffiti? The answer starts with an obsessive engineer who collected Patek Philippe watches and one day bought a car that didn't work. July 22, 1898, James Ward Packard arrives in Cleveland with a wad of cash in his pocket and an obsession in his head. He wants an automobile, not just any automobile. The best money can buy in America. He's 34 years old, a mechanical engineer who graduated from Lehigh University. And together with his brother William, he's built a small empire manufacturing incandescent arc lamps in Warren, Ohio. But cars fascinate him. They represent the future. And James Ward Packard is not a man who settles for the present. Here's something you need to understand about this guy before we go any further. Packard wasn't just an engineer. He was obsessed with precision. He collected Patek Philippe pocket watches, not the regular kind any rich guy buys, but the most complicated timepieces ever made. His most extraordinary piece, the Magnificent, took Swiss watchmakers 3 years to complete. It had a minute repeater with a 3-gong chime, perpetual calendar with moon phase, equation of time, and sunrise and sunset indicators calculated specifically for the latitude of Warren, Ohio. On the back, a deep blue sky disk carried 512 gold stars, rotating at sidereal speed around a tiny Polaris. When Packard died, that watch eventually sold for $1,800,000 at auction. That's the kind of precision this man demanded in everything he touched. So imagine his frustration when he buys automobile number 13 from the Winton Motor Carriage Company for $1,000, a fortune, in an era when the average annual salary didn't even hit $500, and the damn thing doesn't work. It overheats going uphill. It shakes itself apart on rough roads. Packard has to call a team of horses to tow it back to Warren. The man who commissioned watches with 512 gold stars calculated for his exact latitude is now being dragged home by farm animals because his car broke down again. Over the following months, Packard makes trip after trip to Cleveland for repairs. He documents every failure in his personal diary with the meticulous precision he applied to everything. January 2nd, 1899. March 15th. March 28th. When Winton sends a mechanic to Warren because the engine simply won't start. Packard notes in his diary. Very noisy and does not work very well. A man accustomed to Swiss perfection trapped with American junk. June 10th, 1899. Packard returns to Cleveland with a detailed list of improvements. He studied every component of the vehicle. He knows exactly what's wrong and how to fix it. He shows up before Alexander Winton, the Scottish immigrant with the imposing mustache and ego, to match who had founded the company, expecting a conversation between professionals. What he gets instead is an insult that will change the history of the American automobile. If you think you can do better, build your own car. Winton said it with contempt. Packard took it as instructions. Here's the delicious irony. Winton only had 2 customers within 50 miles of Cleveland. And one of them was Packard. He'd just insulted the man who would end up destroying his legacy. 5 months later, November 6, 1899. The first Packard rolls through the streets of Warren. The Warren Daily Chronicle describes it the next day as superior to anything on the market. And they're right. Packard hasn't built a car. He's built a statement of principles. Every component designed with the same obsession he applied to his watches. By 1903, investors from Detroit, led by Henry Bourne Joy, son of the president of the Michigan Central Railroad, have bought the company and moved it to the big city. The slogan they would adopt, "Ask the man who owns one," was born directly from Packard's philosophy. That quality speaks for itself. But they needed a factory, not just any factory, one worthy of the cars they were going to build. And that's where the man who would change not just the Packard plant but all of 20th century industrial architecture comes in. Albert Kahn was born in Ronnen, Germany, in 1869. He arrived in Detroit with his family at age 12, penniless, unable to speak English, carrying nothing but the dreams every immigrant brings. But he had a gift. As a child, he was a piano prodigy. His fingers found the keys with a precision that astonished his teachers. He practiced for hours, lost in the music, imagining a life on the stages of Europe. The problem was money. His family couldn't afford lessons. Poverty ripped the piano from his hands before he could become what he dreamed of being. Then he discovered drawing. Maybe he could be an artist. He studied, practiced, spent entire nights perfecting his technique, until he discovered he was colorblind. He couldn't distinguish certain colors. The diagnosis came like a sentence. Twice life had shown him a path and twice it had slammed the door shut. Piano, art, both impossible. What he had left was architecture. A field where precision mattered more than color. Where obsession with detail was a virtue, not an eccentricity. Where a German immigrant with no connections could prove his worth with every line he drew. Kahn found work at George Mason's firm at 15, starting as an errand boy. By 1903, he had his own firm and a growing reputation. When Henry Joy hired him to design the new Packard factory, Kahn saw an opportunity no one else saw. Factories of that era were death traps, wood and brick construction, dark as dungeons, suffocating in summer, freezing in winter, prone to fires that could kill dozens in minutes. Workers operated in dim light, breathing dust and fumes, risking their lives every shift. Kahn looked at those factories and saw everything wrong with American industry. He wanted to build something different, something revolutionary. His brother Julius, a civil engineer who had served in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, had been experimenting with a new concrete reinforcement technique. The Kahn bar used steel with wings at 45-degree angles that allowed for stronger structures with wider spaces, without needing support columns every few meters. Albert saw the potential immediately. Together, the Kahn brothers were about to change how factories were built around the world. Building number 10 of the Packard Plant, completed in 1905, was the world's first automobile factory built in reinforced concrete. Glass walls that flooded the production lines with natural light, open spaces where there had once been mazes of columns, fire resistance that wooden structures could never match. The concrete absorbed vibrations from heavy machinery that in traditional buildings cracked walls and shook floors. It was, in every sense, an industrial cathedral, a temple dedicated to the new religion of mass production. And Kahn didn't stop there. The first 9 buildings of the complex had been traditional wood and brick construction. When Building 10 proved its superiority, Packard ordered the entire complex rebuilt in reinforced concrete. Over the following decades, the Packard plant grew to cover between 40 and 80 acres, with more than 40 buildings, 3.5 million square feet of manufacturing space, the equivalent of 60 football fields under one roof. Kahn became Detroit's architect and, eventually, the architect of American industry. He designed the Ford Highland Park plant, where Henry Ford installed the first moving assembly line in 1913. He designed Ford's River Rouge complex, which at its peak employed over 100,000 workers. He designed the Willow Run bomber plant that during World War II produced 1 B-24 Liberator per hour. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. By 1938, his firm was responsible for 19% of all architect-designed industrial buildings in the United States. And here's something few people know. Between 1929 and 1932, Albert Kahn designed 521 factories in the Soviet Union and trained 4,000 Soviet architects and engineers. The man who designed the arsenal of American democracy also designed the factories that armed the Red Army. Stalin paid in gold while America sank into the Great Depression. Kahn took the money. Business is business. But the Packard plant was always special. The laboratory where it all began. The place where Kahn perfected the techniques that would revolutionize 20th-century industrial architecture. The concrete was so solid, so perfectly designed, that the building would survive nearly 7 decades of abandonment, hundreds of fires, systematic looting, and eventually cost $26 million to demolish. Kahn built for eternity. He couldn't know that eternity would last only half a century. Now picture the Packard plant in its glory. We're in the 20s and 30s. 40,000 workers come and go in 3 shifts. The thunder of metal against metal never stops. Hydraulic presses stamping body panels, cranes moving engines back and forth, the smell of fresh paint, grease, sweat, progress. Outside, an endless line of railroad cars brings steel, glass, rubber, everything the beast needs to keep producing. And what it produced was unmatched. Packard didn't make cars. They made works of art on wheels. The American Rolls-Royce, they called it, though many argued it was better. In 1915, they introduced the Twin 6, the first production V12 engine in the United States. 424 cubic inches of power so smooth it supposedly inspired a young Enzo Ferrari to create his own V12s decades later. Every engine was individually tested before installation. Every car was inspected dozens of times before leaving the factory. Quality wasn't a slogan. It was an obsession inherited from the founder and his impossible watches. The list of famous owners read like a who's who of global power. Warren G. Harding was the first president to ride to his inauguration in an automobile in 1921. Naturally, he chose a Packard. Franklin D. Roosevelt had a 1939 Packard 12, modified with hand controls to accommodate his paralysis. Clark Gable collected Packards with the same passion he collected lovers in Hollywood, including a 1932 Twin Six Roadster he drove down Sunset Boulevard. Charlie Chaplin bought a 1936 Packard 12 through his studios. The Japanese imperial family owned 10 Packards in 1931, more than any other foreign brand. But the most fascinating customer was Joseph Stalin. The Soviet dictator loved driving his 12-cylinder Packard on the roads near Moscow, sometimes until the early hours of the morning, terrifying his bodyguards who couldn't keep up. The Soviets acquired 10 Packards for official use, and when they needed to build their own limousine for the supreme leader, they simply bought a 1942 Packard Super 8, took it apart piece by piece, and reverse-engineered it to create the ZIS-110 and the armored ZIS-115. The Soviet love for Packard design continued for decades. The Gaz-13 Chaika that Kremlin leaders used until the Gorbachev era was based on Packard lines. At the height of the Cold War, the communists were riding around in copies of a capitalist car. And here's the most delicious irony of all. Henry Ford, the man who democratized the automobile with his Model T, the founder of Ford Motor Company, the anti-Semite who published Nazi propaganda in his newspaper, the industrialist Hitler admired so much he kept his portrait in his office, was carried to his grave on April 7, 1947, in a competitor's car. A Packard. The man who had revolutionized the automotive industry made his final journey in a vehicle that represented everything he wasn't. Exclusive luxury. Artisan production. Quality over quantity. Even in death, Packards were the cars of those who had made it to the top. By 1937, Packard had produced its 1 millionth car. By the time civilian production stopped for World War II, they had manufactured more than 1,600,000 vehicles. They dominated the American luxury market. They were the standard against which everyone else was measured. The Packard Plant was the beating heart of that empire. But the ultimate test of Packard's excellence didn't come in peacetime. It came in war. And it happened because Henry Ford proved, once again, who he really was. July 1940. Europe is burning. France has fallen. Britain stands alone against Nazi Germany. The Royal Air Force's Spitfires and Hurricanes desperately need Rolls-Royce Merlin engines to defend British skies. But British factories can't produce enough while German bombs rain down on them every night. Rolls-Royce needs an American partner. Someone with the mass production capacity to manufacture thousands of engines. Naturally, they approach Ford Motor Company first. Ford agrees. 9,000 Merlin engines. 6,000 for the British, 3,000 for the American Armed Forces. Ford receives the Rolls-Royce blueprints. Receives a sample engine to study. Everything is ready to begin production that could save Britain. And then Henry Ford says no. The man was a notorious anti-Semite and Nazi sympathizer. He published anti-Jewish tirades in his weekly newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, for years. Hitler quoted him in Mein Kampf. Ford was the only American mentioned favorably in that book. The Führer kept a portrait of Ford in his Munich office. In 1938, Ford accepted the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest Nazi decoration for foreigners, from the German consul in Detroit. Now, with Britain fighting alone for its survival against the Nazis, Ford refused to help. His official excuse: he wouldn't supply material to any foreign power involved in conflict, a neutral position that suited perfectly anyone who wanted the Nazis to win. Rolls-Royce needed a new partner. They found one at the Packard Plant. By mid-June 1940, Packard had taken possession of the blueprints and parts that Ford had rejected. What followed was one of the most impressive engineering feats of the war. The Merlin engines were masterpieces of British mechanics, but they were designed for artisan construction. Rolls-Royce built them by hand, with individual adjustments, with parts that often weren't interchangeable between units. Each engine was unique. Beautiful, yes, but impossible to mass-produce. Packard took that design and transformed it. They applied American production techniques while maintaining tolerances of 2/10,000ths of an inch. To put that in perspective, A human hair is approximately 3/1000ths of an inch thick. Packard was working with precision 15 times finer than a hair. And they did it in climate-controlled assembly environments unheard of at the time, because they understood that temperature variations affected measurements. Rolls-Royce engineers who inspected the work in Detroit were amazed. "The precision is so good you can't fit a shilling between the piston and the cylinder wall," one of them commented. The Packard Merlins didn't just match the British originals. In many ways, they surpassed them. American engines arrived polished, with chromed nuts and bolts, while the British were still struggling with basic finishes because their factories were being bombed. 55,523 Merlin engines came out of the Packard plant during the war. Read that number again. 55,523. The engines that powered the legendary P-51 Mustang fighter, transforming it from a decent but low-altitude limited aircraft into arguably the best American combat plane of the war. With the two-stage Merlin, the Mustang could escort B-17 bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Military historians argue that this combination is what allowed the Allies to win the air war over Europe. In addition to the Merlins, Packard built 12,700 marine engines for PT boats, the fast torpedo boats that made a young Massachusetts lieutenant named John F. Kennedy famous. His PT-109 was cut in two by a Japanese destroyer in the Pacific, and Kennedy became a war hero by swimming to save his crew. The engines that powered those boats came from the Packard plant. War contracts totaled $1,720 million, equivalent to nearly $30 billion today. Packard won the prestigious Army-Navy E Award 4 times, an honor given to only 4 or 5% of war production plants. At peak production, 40,000 employees filled the hallways. 3 shifts. 24 hours a day. 7 days a week. Albert Kahn's cathedral vibrated with the effort to win a war that Henry Ford would have preferred not to fight. But the war also revealed cracks, not just in the machines, in the people. And there was a dark side to the Packard plant that nobody put in the corporate brochures. We need to talk about the hell behind the glory, about what it really meant to work in that concrete cathedral. Working conditions at the Packard plant were brutal, like at all automobile factories of the era. In 1929, the average annual salary for an auto worker was $1,639. Sounds decent until you remember that by 1931, in the depths of the Depression, that salary had dropped 54% to just $757, and that's if you were lucky enough to keep your job. In 1932, 400,000 people were unemployed in Michigan alone. Detroit recorded 568 suicides in 1931. Nearly 5 times the 113 of 1927, the city was dying. The heat in summer was suffocating. Foundry areas reached temperatures that could cause heat stroke in minutes. The noise was deafening. A constant roar of machinery that left workers with permanent hearing damage after years of exposure. There was no protection. There was no compensation. If you lost your hearing, that was your problem. Metal dust floated in the air and got into your lungs. Foundry workers breathed particles of iron, copper, aluminum, whatever they were melting that day. There were no proper masks. There wasn't enough ventilation in many areas. What nobody knew then, and what would take decades to discover, was that the factory was poisoning not just its workers but the very ground beneath it. Decades later, when environmental inspectors finally examined the site, they found significant amounts of asbestos scattered alongside insulated pipe systems in bathrooms, warehouses, basements, and tunnels. Large amounts of asbestos debris in the basements of most buildings. Arsenic and selenium in the soil. Between 400,000 and 500,000 tires illegally dumped by companies that rented space there after the closure. Kahn's cathedral was also a toxic time bomb. And then there was the racism. The Packard plant had hired African American workers since World War I, but segregated them systematically. In 1920, Only 5 of Detroit's 67 automotive plants hired black workers. Most of those black workers were at Packard. But not in just any position. Black workers worked in the foundry, the hottest, dirtiest, most dangerous place in the entire factory. Or in sanitation, cleaning up the waste white workers left behind. The jobs nobody else wanted. The jobs that killed you faster. When the company tried to promote black workers to better positions, white workers responded with threats, walkouts, violence. In 1941, Packard promoted black employees to a white area. White workers walked off the job. Packard caved and removed the black employees. When they promoted 3 black women to operate precision drills, white women went on strike and swore they wouldn't return until all 3 were demoted. Packard caved again. Every time the company tried to do the right thing, white workers threatened, and the company got on its knees. Rumors said the Ku Klux Klan had a presence inside the plant, facilitating racial violence, organizing white workers against any advancement for black workers. Nobody seriously investigated. Nobody wanted to know. The main instigator of the 1943 strike was a man named C.E. Weiss, Packard's personnel director. Weiss was a shameless racist who openly spoke about his inability to promote black workers because they shot craps on the job. He also bragged about having been the first executive to bring black people north to break strikes when he worked for Chrysler in 1917. A revealing detail. Weiss didn't hate black people on principle. He used them. He brought them in as strikebreakers when it suited him, and excluded them when white workers complained. To him, black workers were tools, not people. But Weiss was also anti-union, and in 1943, he saw an opportunity to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. By promoting a few black workers, he could divide the United Auto Workers Union from within. He knew exactly how white workers would react. He was counting on it. It was a trap, and everyone fell for it. The strike lasted several days. 25,000 white workers paralyzing airplane engine production while their countrymen were dying in the Pacific. The federal government threatened to fire anyone who didn't return to work. The UAW ordered its members back. Walter Reuther, the most powerful union leader of the era, publicly denounced the strikers. The combination of government and union pressure finally worked. 30 of the ringleaders were suspended on June 6th. The strike ended the next day. 2 weeks later, Detroit exploded in the race riots of 1943. 34 dead. 675 seriously injured. $2 million in property damage. More than 1 million hours of lost war production. Of the 34 dead, 25 were black, 17 of them killed by police. Japanese propagandists used images of the riots to try to convince black American soldiers to stop fighting for a country that hated them. The Packard Plant strike didn't cause the riots, but it was the spark that lit the fuse. Albert Kahn's cathedral was also a temple of hate, and that hate had consequences that reached far beyond its walls. The war ended. Packard had proven it could manufacture the best engines in the world. Now, it had to go back to making cars. And this is where everything started to fall apart. The problem was simple but fatal. During the war years, Packard hadn't developed any new automobile models. All their engineering capacity had been dedicated to the Merlin engines. Meanwhile, Cadillac had been preparing a revolution. In 1949, Cadillac launched a completely new car with a modern, lightweight, powerful V8 engine. Packard was still selling pre-war designs with outdated straight-eight engines. The American Rolls-Royce suddenly looked like your grandfather's car. The company tried to recover. They launched new models, but they made a mistake that would prove fatal. In an attempt to increase sales volume, they started making cheaper cars that looked too much like the luxury models. The strategy destroyed the brand's exclusivity. Why pay double for a luxury Packard if the cheap Packard looked almost the same? Wealthy buyers, who were Packard's natural market, started switching to Cadillac. Budget car buyers preferred Chevrolet or Ford. Packard was trapped in no man's land. Too expensive for the masses. Too common for the elite. By 1954, the company was dying. It needed a partner. It found one in Studebaker, another independent manufacturer, that was also dying. The merger was announced that June. A UAW representative named Lester Fox memorably described it as two drunks trying to help each other across the street. Roy Hurley of Curtiss-Wright used almost the same words when he spoke to Fortune magazine. Everyone knew it was a disaster. No one could stop it. The fundamental problem was that Packard bought Studebaker believing Studebaker's finances were healthier than they actually were. They didn't request an independent audit. Inexplicable for a company that had built its reputation on precision. The reality was that Studebaker needed to sell 282,000 units per year just to break even. In 1954, they had sold barely 82,000. The merger wasn't a marriage of convenience. It was a suicide pact. The factories were too far apart to integrate efficiently. Packard in Detroit, Studebaker in South Bend, Indiana. The corporate cultures were incompatible. Packard focused on luxury, Studebaker on volume. Both companies continued bleeding out. Loss of $29,700,000 in 1955. Catastrophic loss of $102,300,000 in 1956. June 25, 1956, the last real Packard rolls off the Detroit line. A four-door patrician sedan, dark green, with all the luxury features that had defined the brand for half a century. The remaining workers gathered around the car as if it were a coffin. Some were crying. Others just stared in silence, processing the end of an era. 11,000 workers were laid off that day. Albert Kahn's cathedral fell silent for the first time in more than 50 years. What came next was almost worse. The so-called Packard bakers of 57 and 58 were simply Studebakers, with Packard emblems slapped on top. Noticeably smaller cars than real Packards, with fiberglass fins added in an attempt to disguise them. Automotive critic Uncle Tom McCahill wrote that from behind they looked like cars left in the sun too long with the fins starting to melt. It was an insult to the brand James Ward Packard had built from that defective Winton car. July 25, 1958. The last Packard ever built left the South Bend plant. A blue metallic sedan with manual transmission. Only 2,622 Packards were produced that year, outsold even by Checker Motors, the taxi manufacturer. It was the end. 60 years of history, innovation, luxury. Ending in a pathetic whimper. The Detroit factory sat empty. Silence replaced the roar. And what followed was the slow death of a neighborhood that had built its life around those concrete walls. The Packard plant didn't die alone. It took the neighborhood down with it. When you close a factory that employs 40,000 people, you don't just close a factory. You close restaurants, shops, gas stations, barbershops, the entire ecosystem that depended on those weekly paychecks. Workers left to find jobs elsewhere. Families followed the workers. Houses sat empty. And when houses sit empty in Detroit, they don't last long. Decades later, visitors who came to see the ruins of the Packard plant found more than just an abandoned factory. They found a landscape of devastation, stretching in every direction. For every occupied house, there were 4 or 5 abandoned ones, and between 20 and 30 empty lots where homes once stood. Trees grew wild, hiding the few remaining houses, covering with foliage what the economy had destroyed. You could imagine workers from the old days leaving their houses at the sound of the factory whistle, walking 5 minutes to their shift. Now there was no whistle. There were no workers, just ghosts and weeds. Black people had been the last to arrive in the neighborhood, buying houses at low prices after white people fled to the suburbs. They came hoping some development would come their way. Development never came. What came was abandonment, crime, and 68 years of staring at the ruins of a factory that once represented everything America could build. Over the following years, the Packard plant found a second life as an industrial park. By 1960, 39 companies rented space there, employing 4,000 people. In the 80s, 87 companies operated in the complex. Kahn's concrete refused to die. Some companies operated legally. Others dumped chemicals and tires illegally when nobody was looking. The building was slowly getting sick while still breathing. The final collapse began in 1999 when the city evicted the last tenants for demolition. The owner was a man named Dominic Cristini, and what he did next became Detroit urban legend. When the city tried to seize the property to demolish it, Cristini dug in. Literally. He holed up in an office inside the abandoned building. With guns. For 8 months, he refused to come out while lawyers fought it out in court. Picture the scene. One man, armed, living among the ruins of a factory that had built cars for Stalin, defending his right to own rubble nobody else wanted. The cops wouldn't go in. City officials didn't know what to do. Cristini became the guardian of a concrete corpse. A court order stopped the demolition in June 1999. The Michigan Supreme Court ruled that the city had illegally seized the property. Cristini won. The Packard plant lost. Without effective security, without maintenance, without a future, the building was at the mercy of anyone who wanted to walk in. And walk in they did. Boy, did they ever. The looters didn't come with bags and flashlights like movie thieves. They came with trucks and heavy equipment. They drove right up the parking ramps to access the upper floors. They ripped out copper pipes, electrical cables, any metal that could be sold to the scrapyards that had sprouted around the plant like vultures around a carcass. They even removed structural steel, literally dismantling the skeleton of the building Kahn had designed to last centuries. Detroit firefighters issued special orders not to enter. The building was too dangerous. Floors could collapse without warning. Stairways were crumbling. Elevator shafts were death traps in the darkness. When there were fires, and there were constantly, they just let them burn. Firefighters concluded that the fire was too dangerous to fight and there was nothing they could do but let it burn. In the summer of 2009, firefighters were responding to calls at the Packard plant almost every day. A fire could burn for a week without anyone doing anything about it. That same year, urban explorers pushed a dump truck through an opening on the 4th floor and let it fall into the void. Years later, someone tried to push an old Winnebago RV off the roof. The RV caught fire, causing an even bigger blaze. In 2011, the EPA had to return to the plant to remove 7 drums of toxic paint residue. They sent a bill for $35,000. Nobody paid. Kahn's concrete was so resistant that the buildings remained standing even after fire consumed everything inside. The Packard plant became the cathedral of ruin porn, the aesthetic that finds beauty in industrial decay. Photographers from around the world traveled to Detroit specifically to capture images of its ruins. Eminem filmed his beautiful video there in 2009, walking through destroyed hallways while singing about depression and redemption. Transformers shot multiple battle scenes between giant robots using the plant as an apocalyptic backdrop. Amazon's The Grand Tour drove under the famous bridge over Grand Boulevard in January 2019 for the first episode of its 3rd season. With Jeremy Clarkson, Richard Hammond, and James May speeding under the structure that had once served as an assembly line when cars traveled between buildings. The episode premiered January 18th. On January 23rd, 5 days later, the bridge collapsed. Nobody was hurt. Ron Dickerson, a security guard who had worked at the site for 5 years, said he had passed under that bridge thousands of times. It made you nervous to be under it, he admitted. He had seen bricks falling during the morning. By 3 in the afternoon, the entire structure had collapsed onto East Grand Boulevard. Temperatures had gone from below 0 to above 40 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of hours. And the extreme temperature changes, combined with decades of deterioration, had been too much. The bridge had been built in 1939. It had survived 80 years. It didn't survive the winter of 2019. But before the bridge collapsed came the crimes. And before the crimes came the parties. Sometime in the 90s, the abandoned factory became the epicenter of Detroit's rave culture. August 13, 1994. A Canadian DJ named Richie Houghton threw a party called Spastic at the Packard Plant. Invitations were handed out on anonymous flyers. The address was given out by phone line at the last minute. Promotion was done through street posters and last-minute calls. If you wanted to go, you had to know who to ask. It was illegal, dangerous, and absolutely irresistible. More than 1,500 people paid to enter an abandoned building with no official electricity, no working bathrooms, no guarantee that the floor wouldn't collapse under the weight of the dancers. Portable generators powered the sound systems. A single strobe light cut through the darkness. The bass hit so hard you could feel it in your bones, your teeth, your chest. That night, Houghton performed his first live set as Plastic Man, the project that would make him a techno legend. He did it in a room wrapped in black vinyl, inside a half-destroyed factory, surrounded by people who had come to dance among the rubble. Daniel Miller, founder of Mute Records and Houghton's label, flew in from England specifically to witness it. The Blessed Madonna, then a young raver who years later would become one of the world's most famous DJs, was in the crowd. Her musical trajectory was shaped by that experience. Detroit techno, born in basements and underground clubs in the early 80s, thanks to pioneers like Juan Atkins, Derek May, and Kevin Saunderson, found a new home in the guts of the industry that had defined the city and then abandoned it. Veterans of those parties have a phrase they repeat. If you spend a night at Packard, you'd have black boogers for days afterward. The dust, the grime, decades of industrial waste you breathed while dancing until dawn. Nobody knew exactly what that air contained. Asbestos, probably. Metal particles. The ghosts of 40,000 workers turned to dust. Nobody cared. The music was too good. The energy was too intense. And in August 2015, the tiger arrived. A British photographer named David Yarrow, known for his wildlife images, decided Detroit would be the perfect setting for a photo shoot. He brought a Bengal tiger, 2 wolves, and a lynx. He had permits from the city of Detroit. But nobody at the Packard plant knew animals were coming. When site administrators discovered there was a real tiger walking through the factory ruins, they tried to cancel the shoot, but it was too late. The tiger had settled into a stairwell on the 4th floor and had no intention of moving. Andy DiDeRossi, a 28-year-old Detroiter who had founded a tour bus company, got a call from a friend. "I need you to help me get this tiger out of a stairwell," they told him. "Do you have a leaf blower?" DiDeRossi didn't have a leaf blower. He had a weed whacker. He grabbed it, got in his truck, and drove to the Packard plant. Because, of course, tiger. The idea was to make loud noise to scare the animal back into its cage. It didn't work. The tiger growled throughout the whole process. DiDeRossi would later say the animal just wanted to be left alone. Eventually, professional trainers managed to convince the tiger to return to its trailer. The photo shoot was canceled. Nobody was hurt. DiDeRossi posted on social media, "Whatever else happens this year, this will be the second stupidest thing I did in 2015. Only in Detroit. Only at the Packard plant." But the ruins also held secrets darker than tigers and parties. October 28, 2013. T.N. Brown, a third-year law student at Wayne State University, finishes an online exam in the campus library around 11 at night. She's 33 years old, a single mother of 3 children, ages 1, 8, and 14. President of the Intellectual Property Law Students Association. Board member of a nonprofit that works with disadvantaged Detroit children. She has a bachelor's degree in biological sciences and 2 master's degrees. She's months away from graduating as a lawyer. That night, she doesn't make it home to pick up her kids. 2 days later, her body is found inside her purple Chevrolet Trailblazer, parked in a vacant lot next to the Packard plant. The personalized license plate spelled out her name, Tin. She was still buckled in her seatbelt. She had been shot once in the head, behind the ear. Her mother, who had searched desperately for her, said it was like a nightmare you don't wake up from. 2 homeless men were arrested after police found them with Tian's phone. They were charged with misdemeanors related to the theft, but never with the murder. More than a decade later, the case remains unsolved. Wayne State awarded her law degree posthumously. Her children grew up without a mother. Christmas Eve, 2013. Less than 2 months later. Urban explorers walking through the dark hallways of the Packard plant at 7 in the evening discover another body. Marco Davis, 21 years old, frozen in the December cold. Investigators found visible trauma to the neck, suggesting strangulation. Another unsolved case. In January 2019, a 21-year-old man died after falling down an elevator shaft while playing hide-and-seek with friends in the abandoned building. Firefighters had orders not to enter. Young people went in anyway. The pull of the ruins was too strong. Death wasn't enough of a deterrent. And in February 2013, someone placed aluminum sheets in the windows of the bridge over Grand Boulevard. The letters spelled out, Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. The Nazi concentration camp slogan. Someone thought it was funny, or profound, or provocative to put Nazi propaganda in the ruins of a factory that had built engines to defeat the Nazis. Community volunteers removed the letters quickly, but the photos had already gone viral online. In 2010, someone discovered a mural on one of the interior walls. A sad African-American boy holding a can of red paint, next to the words, I remember when all this was trees. The signature was unmistakable. Banksy, the world's most famous British street artist, had left his mark on the Packard plant. Volunteers from a local gallery cut out the 1,500-pound concrete block and moved it to their space. In 2015, they auctioned it in Beverly Hills for $137,500. December 12, 2013. Fernando Palazuelo, a Peruvian Spanish developer, buys 3.5 million square feet of buildings for $405,000, less than the cost of a Manhattan apartment. He promised $350 million in development. During the first few months, there were signs of progress. Security guards, debris cleanup, a groundbreaking ceremony in May 2017, with Palazuelo holding a ceremonial shovel in front of cameras. And then, nothing. He lost $80 million in financing when a Peruvian investor pulled out. Citing fears of a global economic slowdown, he racked up over $1,500,000 in unpaid taxes. He stopped showing up to court hearings. He stopped returning calls. From Lima, where he lived and managed other businesses, the Packard plant became a problem he preferred to ignore. Mayor Mike Duggan called it a source of national embarrassment and said that for 68 years the ruins had been a weight around the neck of Detroit's recovery. Demolition began in October 2022 and was completed in December 2024. December 1, 2025. Detroit announces Packard Park, $50 million to transform 28 acres of the former complex. A nearly 400,000 square foot industrial building that will create 300 manufacturing jobs, 42 affordable housing units, Detroit's first indoor skating rink, and MODEM, the Museum of Detroit Electronic Music, on the same spot where Richie Houghton invented Plastic Man. The firm designing the project is Albert Kahn Associates, the same company Albert Kahn founded 130 years ago. The architect, who couldn't be a pianist or an artist, ended up creating a firm that survived over a century and will now design the rebirth of the building that made him famous. Only 2 of Kahn's structures were saved from demolition. 228,000 square feet of the original 3.5 million, less than 7%. If everything goes according to plan, Packard Park will open its doors around 2029. Valeria Berry has lived next to the Packard plant her entire life. She's seen everything at that building, even when the tiger escaped. When asked what the Packard Park announcement meant, she said something that sums up 68 years of waiting. When you're on this side, you just look at this building. To be able to look up front and see people moving will be something wonderful. Wonderful. 68 years waiting to see something other than ruins. And somewhere, in the vaults of the Patek Philippe Museum, or in a private collection, there's a pocket watch, with 512 gold stars, rotating at sidereal speed, calculated for the latitude of Warren, Ohio, the watch James Ward Packard commissioned before he died. The watch that represents everything he was: obsessive, precise, determined that things should work properly. The watch is still running, almost a century later, while the factory that bore his name no longer exists. That's how the cathedrals America builds and then abandons end. With excavators tearing down concrete designed for eternity. With promises that this time we'll build something that lasts.